Hello and welcome to today's Missio Nexus webinar. I'm Heather Pubels, the founder of Le Motif, a communications consulting firm and Missio Nexus member organization. I'm also the editor of Evangelical Missions Quarterly. I'm partnering with Missio Nexus to discover topics and find effective presenters that can address ways mission agencies can improve their marketing and communications efforts. Before we get started with the webinar, I want to let you know that Missio Nexus has a group called Communications. If you are involved in marketing or communications with a mission agency, this group is for you. It's a great place for you to learn, meet with, or be encouraged by others in your domain. At the end of this webinar, I'll give you instructions on how to find and sign up for that group. For today, Mary Tyndall will be presenting our webinar entitled Thought Leadership for Servant Leaders. Mary is a marketing agency owner, thought leadership strategist, and writer based in Orlando, Florida. She has more than a decade of experience ghostwriting for executives and nonprofit leaders. Mary, what's something that you've learned while you've been ghostwriting?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think I've learned how to really listen to the unique ways that people talk so that I can mirror that when I'm writing in their voice. So I once worked with a CEO for a nonprofit here in town, and he was from South Carolina. So he had some interesting regional expressions that he would pepper into his speech. And I just remember one time he said, "Don't get wrapped around the axle about that." And I was like, wrapped around the axle. I looked it up and it had something to do with, a horse-drawn carriage and the reins of the horse getting wrapped around the wheels of the carriage. And I thought, wow, I need to note that one so I can use that in a speech or a byline for him someday. So listening is really important.
That's great. Thank you, Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, please put your questions in the chat panel as you think of them. We'll get to as many of them as we can. And Mary, it's great to have you here with us today, and welcome. You can go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here with everyone today. And I've enjoyed working with Heather for many years, so I'm excited to get to share about this topic because it's something that I really care about and I think is important to so many people, and is really going to help the work that you do within missions organizations, really no matter where you work and no matter what your job title is. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and present this at the full screen. Oh, good. My cloud video is working. Okay. So today we're talking about thought leadership for servant leaders, and I'm going to explain why we titled it this way. But first, I'm going to just pick up with Heather's intro here. She basically said everything, but I'm coming at this topic as someone who's a trained journalist, a former public relations executive, and today a small business owner. So over my career, I've gotten to work with lots of CEOs, lots of leaders, lots of staff who support the C-suite and leaders at nonprofits. And so I've gotten exposure to lots of different industries. And what I'd like to do is help to translate some of those business concepts within a mission setting today. So that is a little on my background. What we're going to cover today is what is thought leadership? Why does it matter for servant leaders? Laying a foundation for how to practice thought leadership, and then sharing some practical tips and next steps to help you get started or continue, because I know some of you probably are doing some of this in some fashion. So with that, let's go ahead and look at a common sort of business definition of thought leadership. Thought leaders are the informed opinion leaders and the go-to people in their field of expertise. They're trusted sources. They move and inspire people with innovative ideas. They turn those ideas into reality, and they know and show how to replicate their success. So a few things that I think are pertinent to us in the mission space would be trust, building the trust, being the go-to source for information, and then showing others how to replicate our success. So from a mission standpoint, how can we help others to do more to have a greater impact? How can we share what we've learned and pass it along and grow our impact over time? Now, carrying over thought leadership into a missions context, though, there are some differences. So thought leaders play a critical role in missions. They can change the world through ideas, expertise, wisdom. They cast a vision. They inspire others to join them. They spark global movements. As I'm sharing this, you might have specific people in mind that you know, that inspire you, that influence you, who are thought leaders in your space. So think of those people and what they bring and how they have influenced you. And I'd love to take a moment and in the chat, type in who inspires you in your faith, who has influenced your work in missions, whose ideas and messages have shaped your life. So take a moment and reflect on who is a thought leader that you have been inspired by. And then we'll go through and we'll read some of the responses. So who inspires you? It could be a hero of the faith. It could be an author, a pastor, or even someone in your everyday life who's not a household name. Think of the people who have influenced your work, who have left a legacy, if they're no longer alive, the people whose words and messages still ring true for you today.
I was just thinking that Amy Carmichael is somebody who's been an inspiration for me. So missionary in India, was very involved in prayer as well. Debbie Sanders has said Dr. John Stott, Carl Medeiros, an author and speaker, Dr. David Sanders, faculty at Judson University, and Amy Carmichael. Ken has said John Piper, Gordon Fee, professor at Regent College.
Yeah. These are great contributions. I've heard some of these names, others I haven't. It makes me want to look them up after we get off the call today. So as you're thinking of these names, be thinking about what it is about these leaders that inspires you to keep listening. What is it that makes them relevant and timely for you, and makes them someone that you see as an expert and a resource? And those are things that you can learn how to share in your own way and on your own platform. And that's what we're going to be covering today. All right. Going to the next slide here. All right. So I want to reflect for a moment on the concept of servant leadership and what that entails. You all working in missions organizations are probably well acquainted with this concept. I think all of us to some degree would see ourselves as servant leaders in some capacity when we're working within missions. But in the words of Jesus, he said, Jesus called to them to him and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So when we're thinking about how to translate thought leadership to a missions context, one thing that jumps out to me about this verse is the concept that we don't need to exercise authority over or lord it over someone when we have more knowledge or wisdom or expertise. So our definition of thought leadership might be a little bit more generous, a little bit more selfless, and a little bit less about building a personal brand and a little bit more about advancing a mission. So just to break down and expand a little bit more on what I believe the Bible says about servant leadership, these are some characteristics that we can see in servant leaders. Things like wisdom, humility, generosity, a willingness to speak truth, an ability to connect with people where they are at the level that they're at right now. And interestingly, all of these are actually ingredients for compelling thought leadership. These are things that I try to help my clients in industry and business to demonstrate in their work. Some folks are naturally this way, some are not. I think there's definitely a humbling aspect to becoming a thought leader when you start from the standpoint of being a servant and serving others through your expertise. So my encouragement to you today is that thought leadership is a set of skills that you can grow. Thought leadership is different for servant leaders, and our focus is furthering the kingdom versus building a brand. So I'd love if everyone in the chat could take a moment and reflect on your role in your organization, whether you're a leader or your communication staff working with leaders, where you might fit within the practice of thought leadership. So type in a response to this. Are you going to be building thought leadership for yourself, or are you going to be supporting thought leadership in your organization? I would just love to get a feel for the mix of people that we have right now. And while we're waiting for those to come in, we had a few more contributions to our question earlier. We have pastor and author Philip A. Ross from Marietta, Ohio, Jack Miller and David Pellison, both incredible examples of humility and servanthood. So thank you, Ray and Ashley, for sharing those names. So a couple people here are doing both. Thought leadership for themselves and supporting it in their organization. And then some others are only supporting. I'd love for us to expand the definition of thought leadership to include all of us in all of our roles. So whether your name is on the article or you're the person being interviewed, even if you're behind the scenes and in a supporting role, you can be a thought partner and an important contributor to the process of thought leadership in your organization by helping to refine and shape those ideas that are being birthed within your missions agency. So I have a couple comments here that I'm going to just read out. People are saying they support other thought leaders, but they do a fair amount of writing as well. So thank you, Ken. Kevin says he's a provost in a European theological seminary. He'd like to develop his own thought leadership and certainly support the thought leadership of the president. So that's a good response. You can do both. You can establish your own while also supporting a colleague or a peer. So I think as thought leaders, it's important to remember that we're not competing with each other. We can support and complement each other in our respective roles. So thank you so much for everyone's contributions here. All right, continuing on here. I'd like to lay a foundation for the practice of thought leadership. And this really kind of gets to the philosophy for thought leadership. Super famous quote. I'm sure everyone here has heard it. And I think it's a great reminder for us whenever we go to share ideas. All truth is God's truth. So when we look at what can we share that's unique, that's powerful, that's going to compel people to join us in this mission that we're on, I think it's important to remember that that authority ultimately comes from God, right? And we are a mouthpiece, we are the channel, but we are ultimately referring people back to God as the source of all truth. So whatever expertise we have is truly derived from, what he's given us and the intellectual powers that he's given us. And all of us can, I think, take a lot of confidence in that truth, that we are not out here building a platform for ourselves. We're really platforming God. We're making him known through our thought leadership. So let's take this a step further and perhaps offer a new definition for thought leadership for servant leaders in a missions context. I'd love to hear any thoughts on this in the chat if you would define this differently. This is just something that I cooked up that I think applies to the work that a lot of us are doing. Thought leadership is about communicating timeless truth, using fresh ideas, insights, and perspectives, so we can share the gospel, invite others into the Great Commission, and spread best practices in missions. So I'd love to hear your take on this. Does this ring true for you? Is this something that you think could benefit your organization? Would you define it differently? So curious to hear in the chat here. And while we are getting those answers, I'll also read through a couple of other responses. Suzanne says she's in a middle management role where she's connecting senior leaders who are the primary thought leaders and their ideas and agendas with the day-to-day content decisions for the communications team. Excellent. Thank you, Suzanne. Ashley says that she and her husband are both missionaries in a remote First Nation. They bring vision to the community by coming alongside believers in native church plant, inspiring and communicating via video and bringing visionary direction as a shepherding team. Excellent. So we have a really great mix of folks here. And so I encourage you to really reflect on what this could mean for you. Thank you, Kevin, for sharing. You're still trying to grasp what thought leadership is. We're going to dive in a little deeper. We're still talking on a pretty theoretical level here. Fresh ideas, contextual awareness to the culture and people group. Excellent. Thank you. So Debbie brings up a good point that I just want to pause on for a moment. When we are talking about thought leadership, I'm coming at this from the standpoint that your audience is people in the, let's say, Western hemisphere who are needing to be educated or reached in regard to missions and the Great Commission. So inviting people in as well as sharing the gospel in those settings. My expertise is not really in translating, those ideas to other cultures and people groups, but certainly in your roles, you could bring principles of thought leadership into that type of work. But I'm primarily talking about, how do we speak to people who are from a more similar background, but I love the diversity of thought here. All right. So a few thought starters to ask when we look at how do we define thought leadership? Someone asked what actually is thought leadership? Thought leadership is sharing perspectives and ideas that are fresh, that are compelling, that are inspiring. And these are some questions that you can ask yourself to get those conversations flowing in your organization. So what has God laid on our hearts? What is the thing that is burning in our hearts to share with the world, right? So what is either the specific aspect of the gospel that we are sharing through our organization, or the specific people group that we're reaching, or the specific niche that we have within missions? What is it that is weighing on us, the burden that God has laid on our hearts? I'd love to have you chat this out if you want to share this, because I think this could be a good thought starter as well. So, what has God laid on your heart? What is working well in your organization? So by codifying what is working well, the best practices that exist in your organization, you can create thought leadership that inspires others to do their jobs more effectively, to have a bigger impact. That is a form of thought leadership. What do others need to know? What is the thing that you think others are missing? What is the point that people need to understand to better understand missions, to better understand the people that they're trying to reach? When you think about the missions industry, the missions community, the broader missions community, what do your peers in other organizations struggle with? What are you hearing in conversation that you feel like maybe you have unlocked successfully or are still working through in your organization? So feel free to chat your responses to this too. What misconceptions can you correct? So I think we've all been in situations where you feel like someone on the other side is not really getting what you're saying. And it's because they assumed something in the beginning where, if they had the correct view or conception, they would be in a completely different place, right? So thought leadership is a way in which we can correct some misconceptions. What's changing in the world and what does the future look like? So I think within missions organizations, at least when I worked in a missions organization, it can feel a little bit like the world and the workplace are completely different, right? Like your role in the world is completely different from your role at work, or maybe not, maybe there's more intersection. But I think it's important in missions to really speak to the reality of what is happening in the world today and how the gospel fits in, how the gospel changes lives today in our unique time and setting and culture. And what does the future look like, and how does the gospel speak to that future? I think there are so many hot button issues today that the Bible speaks to, that our faith can address. And so through thought leadership, we can share truth on those topics. All right, I'm going to take a moment and read through the chat here. Discerning among a very small interest group God's will with regard to a new idea, God's power of free power, a living parable of the man born blind. That sounds very intriguing, Ray. Thank you for that contribution. Okay, so going to keep going here through these slides. So when we think about what we want to share, a good place to start is finding the big idea. So the big idea is the framework that all of our other smaller ideas are going to hang off of, right? What is the unique and fresh insight that you can share with the world? Stephen Johnson has a great TED Talk about listening to the slow hunch. So the slow hunch is sort of this inkling of an idea that percolates in your brain for a while. It might take years to come to maturation. It might take lots of conversations and reflections and real lived experiences to identify. But the slow hunch is basically the seedling of an idea. So, to touch on what Ray mentioned a moment ago, he's got this seedling of an idea that he's reflecting on over time. And I think all of us, if we take a moment to reflect, have probably got some of those things perhaps lying dormant within our minds. So the idea of listening to what God is telling us, what he's putting on our hearts, and being willing to let that process take time. I'd encourage you to look up Stephen Johnson's TED Talk for more on that idea. Gathering data. So I think all of us probably have unique data points in our organizations, and I'd be curious to hear what types of things your organization is measuring, whether it's statistics on churched versus unchurched people in different countries, or findings on what type of Bible translation is most effective for people at different levels of literacy, right? There are probably some interesting tidbits of wisdom that you can share with a broader audience than just the organization that you work for. Talking with others. So I think conversation is one of the most inspirational and generative ways that we can refine our ideas and make connections between different spaces. So I'm sure if you talk with a colleague at a conference who's working in a different country, they're going to have a different perspective than you might on the same topic, just because of cultural background or other things that come into play. And it's through finding those points of connection that we can create ideas that are really transformative. Connecting the dots in disparate areas is what I'm talking about here. So naming, explaining, pattern making, recommending, and predicting are 5 good categories of thought. So right now we're still kind of dealing in the abstract, but I'd love for you to think about what types of patterns and trends are you seeing? What types of predictions can you be making about what God is doing in the world? Obviously, we're not God. We don't know the future, but we can look at reality today and say, based on what we can see today, based on what we know of God's character, based on, the way the world is changing, this is the truth that we need to come back to. And this is perhaps the fresh insight that's going to help us to better live our lives. All right. I want to share with you an example of thought leadership and help this to crystallize a little bit more. So this is a piece that I got to play a supporting role in with two authors who are missionaries in Italy. They're actually from Brazil originally, and they wrote the first draft of this. I worked with Heather on this piece, and I had the chance to come in and sort of do some editing and some reshaping here to help organize and improve the flow of this piece. But the topic here is helping Generation Z flourish and be catalysts for God's mission. So this is a great illustration of taking a reality, a trend in the world, which is, the emergence of Generation Z, the fact that they are becoming adults and entering the world of missions, entering the world of business, and then saying, okay, how can we reach them? And using the author's experience, using their story, we're going to share some insights that are going to help other missions leaders reach that next generation. So one thing I want to flag from their article is their point that God is raising up the global South. So this is not the first time that anyone has noted this, but they are saying, they're providing evidence that this is true in their experience. So alongside the emergence of Gen Z, we must also recognize that missions is no longer from the West to the rest. God is raising up people across Latin America, including Brazil, in Kenya, China, Korea, and many more nations. And we're seeing a global sending church. So the authors are a great example of this, being Brazilian missionaries who are now serving in Italy. They are really the living testimonial of exactly what it is they're talking about. So I'd encourage you in thought leadership to really lean on your lived experience and what you have seen and what you have learned and the wisdom that you've gained throughout your life, because that is the thing that's going to make you a trustworthy source for others. And I think all of us probably have more of that than we even realize. So even take a moment and reflect on this in the chat if you'd like. What are some ways, some lessons that you've learned throughout your career in missions that you think could be valuable for others? So just let's do a quick brainstorm on that. What do you think you could share from your experience? And Heather, I'm going to allow you, if anyone has anything to share, to just read that off, because I'm going to keep on going through the slides.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right. So while we're waiting for any responses on that, I want to reflect on this point. Once we've identified the big idea that we want to share, and I'd love for you to really think through that and what that could mean for you, even after we get off this call, because it might take some time. How do we then share that big idea? I think one of the best vehicles for thought leadership is actually in storytelling. So sharing a moment that you experience that brings a concept to life. So, I think about that photo that we just saw that accompanied that article of the baptism, describing what it feels like, to baptize a Generation Z believer and reflect on what that says about, your life, your career in missions. That could be an entry point to a very compelling piece of thought leadership. So really painting a picture that people can visualize. Now, we're talking written form right now, but of course, thought leadership can be used across mediums. So audio, video. I'm starting with writing because I think that's the easiest thing to start with for many of us. It's very low tech. You simply just need to, put your thoughts on the page. Work with a thought partner in your organization if needed to help coax those ideas out and get them down. But it's something that any of us can do today. Painting a picture using very simple, concrete, memorable language. And I'll get to more on that in a moment. And using humor when appropriate. So even though a lot of what we're working on in our organizations is very serious and it's very spiritual and it's somewhat heavy, when we talk about the gospel and the implications of that, there's also such a lightness to it in the fact that we are sharing the good news. And, we can feel free to bring in some moments of hope and humor and levity when appropriate.
We have one answer to the question you were asking. What do you think you could share from your experience that would be valuable to others? And Barb G from Global Disciples has shared helping to equip the near culture worker to access the least reached people. And she says, we love telling amazing stories.
Awesome. I'm not familiar with the near culture worker. Does anyone know? Barb, can you share what that term means? Or Heather, maybe you know?
Barb, I think you're just talking about people who are maybe from a country who are not a part of maybe an unreached or least reached people group, but they do share some cultural similarities with them. So just equipping them to reach out to the least reached in their nation. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. So she says disciples reaching those who are similar or the same culture. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. See, I mean, that's a great example of something that Barb knew and a passion that was on her heart that was unfamiliar to me. And probably, Barb, I would imagine you have so much valuable wisdom to share on that topic. All right. So continuing on through to the next slide here. A couple other ideas here. I want to just encourage us to learn from the example of Jesus. I think he's one of the best storytellers, certainly the best servant leader of all time. In his parables, some things that he used to really drive a point home and to reach his audience are things like vivid metaphors. So I've got this image here of, the seeds in the hands of the sower. When we hear the parables of Jesus, we can imagine them so vividly. And we know that they were very relevant to the culture that he lived in at that time. And they would have had such incredible meaning to the average person, to the person, the farmer, the person, the fisherman, the average lay person. So sometimes when we think thought leadership, we think I have to polish everything and include jargon and make it, like university level writing. It really doesn't have to be that way. Really think of your audience and what they need to hear from you. Another powerful principle that I think works really well in thought leadership is amplification. So the strategic repetition and building on words and concepts. So I think a great example is the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. There's that parallelism in that sentence there. So when you get to the point where you're sharing your big idea, think about the things, the phrases that are going to make it really memorable, and how can you repeat them and make them top of mind for people for years to come. And then again, speaking the language of your audience, being very clear over being clever. I think when we think of thought leadership, sometimes we wonder if we need to be, like marketers, like, do we need to phrase things in just the right way? So I think there's a place certainly for making things memorable and using vivid language, but then also remembering that ultimately we need to be clear. We need people to understand what it is we're trying to say. And sometimes that means making sentences shorter, making things more direct, breaking down an abstract idea into something that is more bite-sized. So thought leadership doesn't have to be up in the clouds. It can be a new take on something that's still very accessible to people, and the way that we talk day to day, right? In conversation, it can be conversational. All right, we're going to keep going here. A couple other principles of effective thought leadership. So being bold. I mean, again, Jesus was bold. He would speak truth to power. He would provoke discussion. He wanted people to have their eyes opened to truth, right? And so following in his footsteps, we can freely share ideas that might be different. They might be counterintuitive. They might be unconventional, right? In the realm of like what's worked in the past. Maybe something new needs to emerge or be birthed in your organization. And so being bold about the way that you share that, being courageous, and then balancing that with, the need to speak truth with kindness, balancing wisdom and compassion, speaking directly, but also speaking with kindness. And then finally, giving freely, being generous with your ideas. So in the business realm where I spend most of my time, there's kind of a lot of protectiveness around ideas and intellectual property and the secret sauce, right? And one thing I counsel my clients on is you want to be generous with your ideas to the extent that people see you as a resource, as someone they can trust, as someone they can turn to, because then when they need more information about that topic, they're going to come to you. They're going to remember that you were a source of that information. And I think the same is true in missions, and even a step further in the missions realm, I would say, like, I think we have an obligation or a duty even to share what's working for us in our organizations, to be generous with our ideas and the ways that God is working. And I think that there's such a beautiful spirit of collaboration and synergy that comes forth when everyone is willing to share and kind of let go of the pride of authorship, the pride of ownership that might be associated with, a personal brand. So again, it's kind of a redefinition of thought leadership. All right, I want to share another example. This is also from Evangelical Missions Quarterly, that the issue that I worked on with Heather. And this was a really interesting piece, again, on Generation Z, because that was the theme of this issue. And what I wanted to share here was how this author was able to take a concept that is fairly secular, right? Generational theory, and then bridge it with his wisdom and insights from a long career in missions. I think this is another example of kind of shining a light on the reality of the world through the lens of scripture and truth. So there's a section here over on the right-hand side of the screen. What we're displaying right now is the screenshot of this article. And there's a column here where the subhead is called Inviting Gen Z into God's Mission. And so this goes on to say, for millennials, the invitation to God's mission was enough. For a lot of mission agencies, this was a high point, but inviting Gen Z to mission is very different. A vision for the mission isn't enough. They're more risk averse and less trusting. They want to know, what's your plan? What are my benefits? And so really bringing reality and truth to bear on what is happening in the world, and then breaking out spiritual questions by generation. What is true? What is real? What is good? What is beautiful? These are ways that we can answer the world's questions through the expertise and the wisdom that we have gained in our career and missions. All right, let me continue on through here. Where to share thought leadership. So let's say you've got your big idea identified, you've written a piece. Where can you then share it and get more eyes on it? Some of the most obvious places to start would be if your organization has a blog, blogging regularly, making sure that those blog posts are being shared with your email subscribers, being distributed on social media, that everything that you are producing is accessible to people in multiple formats, ideally. So, taking the little snippets of your idea and using them on social to drive to your blog post. Guest articles. So, publications like EMQ and other publications in your space, contributing your wisdom in the form of, an article or some other bylined piece. Writing a book. Some of us here perhaps are dreaming of writing a book one day, or work with leaders who are writing books. And that can certainly be a massive undertaking, but it all starts with that first page. And then some organizations often put out like annual reports, studies, surveys. This again goes to, sharing data, sharing unique insights and findings that might be sort of hidden within your organization, surfacing those things so they can reach a broader audience. YouTube and podcast channels, either channels that you run at your organization or becoming a guest on other channels. Media outreach, so pitching to faith-based media or even local media. If you are, let's say, like from Illinois, you could pitch Illinois media about some aspect of your work if there's any connection or any relevance there. And then speaking engagements, so getting on stages, getting in front of bigger groups of people. That's sort of like another level. Once you've started to formulate your ideas, you're going to want to get some practice and test them within small groups within your organization. Present internally before presenting externally and see what's resonating and take feedback. So those are just some ideas of ways to share thought leadership. And then I would recommend just have a vision for thought leadership, just like anything in missions. Like there's a faith component to this. Results are going to take time and they might be hard to measure. Test and refine as you go. Ask people to listen to you. Ask if they're getting confused about anything. Really listening to feedback is going to help you to make that idea ready for a broader stage. And that is the conclusion of my presentation, but I'd love to open this up to a discussion for any questions, any ideas that you might have about how you could use thought leadership in your organization, and just an invitation if anyone has any thoughts on anything that I've shared.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, anyone, if you have any questions, you can post them in the chat panel and I'll ask them to Mary. Just to get us started, Mary, I have a question for you. Mm-hmm. As people are looking for channels to be able to share their thought leadership ideas, is mm-hmm. there a percentage that you should consider doing within your own internal, your own channels that you own as opposed to outside ones?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say in the beginning, probably 100% on your own channels.
Okay.
And then grow to perhaps like a 75% on your own channels or 50% on your own channels and 50% elsewhere. I think you certainly want to get some practice and get some feedback on what you're sharing before bringing it to a broader setting. So there's a lot of value in tapping into different audiences and partnerships. And I think like you should start laying the foundation for that now. But in the meantime, don't wait, start publishing today on the things that God is telling you to care about.
And what's a way that you can measure how successful your pieces are when they're getting out there, whether in your owned channels or external channels?
There's a couple ways. I mean, quantitatively, you can look at the kind of traffic that you're getting. Like, are people clicking through from your social channels to your website, and how many people are visiting, and what types of content are they most interested in, right? But then I think qualitatively, you can look at what kind of conversations are you starting? Like, what are you hearing from people if you're running into them at a conference, or are they emailing you? Are you getting any kind of engagement? Are you getting any pushback? I think there's a lot of value in someone saying, hey, I actually see this differently, right? And that is good. You want to have that kind of engagement with your ideas.
Yeah, that's great. I've got a question here from Suzanne. She says, can you expand a little on the idea of furthering a kingdom versus building a brand? What's the distinction between these? Are they mutually exclusive, or is there intersection? And maybe give an example.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this from the standpoint that most of the clients I work with on like the corporate side of my business are really trying to build a platform for an individual. They want that executive to be more visible, drive more revenue to the company. Ultimately, it's a very business-oriented metric. And I think in missions, if we think about personal brands, we're not getting the whole picture, right? We are not in service of ourselves. Ultimately, we are in service of furthering the kingdom. So I think there's a lot of value in becoming prominent and trusted within your space, within the missions community, to the extent that you're being of service, like you're ultimately furthering the kingdom rather than building a platform. Does that make sense, Suzanne? I think as far as an example.
Yeah, she says it's helpful.
That's helpful. Okay. I think as far as an example, I would say like there's pastors that I really respect, like my own pastor. I would give that example. Like he is very humble and very down to earth, and yet still inspires me to think in a completely different way about scripture. He's a jail chaplain, so he's bivocational, and jail chaplain Monday through Friday, and really brings a lot of like real world concepts into his sermons. So it's very relatable. It's very down to earth. I don't think he would ever consider himself a thought leader, but he's certainly influential in our congregation. And he's not about building a platform. So I think all of us, if we think about it, can probably find some examples in our lives of people that we respect and admire. And, in the business world, we might say like, oh, you need 100,000 people following you or 500,000 people following you to be a thought leader, right? Like you have to get to a certain level of success. But I think we can define success in a different way in our space. Like how many lives are we changing? How many people are we able to impact? Even if it's a smaller number of people, like what is the quality of that impact versus like, $1 million in revenue? Maybe our metrics are going to be different.
Yeah, that's good. Barb has asked, does the thought leader need to be the organization's leader or someone within the organization in general? Does it need to be a particular face?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think all of us can practice thought leadership without needing to be the head of the organization or the VP or we don't need a title in order to influence others. From an organizational standpoint and thinking as a marketer, you do want to have some consistency in who is sharing your organization's message. So I would usually defer to the president, the CEO, like the highest level of authority in your organization should ideally have some sort of thought leadership practice. And if you're in a supporting role, you're a key part of that practice, because I think a lot of CEOs are very visionary, but they really lack the time or the resources to channel those ideas. So it's being mindful of where those ideas are and being a good listener within your organization to say, hey, that was a really compelling thing that so-and-so just said. Like, let's write a blog on that, or let's turn that into a podcast episode. It's kind of being the eyes and ears in your organization to spot those messages and be that partner to make them heard by more people.
Yeah, that's good. I'm wondering, Mary, can thought leadership open up your organization to influence audiences you may not have thought of before?
Yeah, I mean, ideally it should. I think that's the hope and the prayer is that, people can be reached in new ways. And I mean, the phrase thought leadership has only been around for like a couple decades. I might be a little off on that, but it's a more recent concept. But I mean, Jesus was a thought leader. Like the church fathers were thought leaders, like famous missionaries from centuries ago were thought leaders. They were influencers in a way, right? So it's really a timeless practice of being able to speak up with what God has laid on our hearts and taking that courageous step of saying, I think more people need to hear this.
Another question for you is, outside of the faces of the organization, is there a way that people can discern others in their organization who have great ideas, who need to become more of a face because of the ideas that they have? How do you find those people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in general, organizations that have a culture of openness and sort of psychological safety, where people can freely share ideas and feel like their voice matters, those organizations are going to be more successful in cultivating thought leadership from the ground up, right? Kind of letting it bubble up to the surface. I think it's number one, creating a culture in your organization where people feel like their ideas and opinions matter. And then having some sort of way to collect those insights. So whether it be through brainstorms or through like regular meetings that you all are already having, posing a question, a thought starter question, like, hey, what's really on your heart lately? Or like, what have you learned in your work recently? What is a misconception that you think people have about anything related to our work, right? I'm trying to keep it general because I know we have a lot of different folks here, but I think proactively asking those questions and then listening for the responses. And then depending on, who pipes up and has something to share, then coming up to that person, bringing them alongside and say, hey, let's work on getting this to a broader audience. Like, first of all, let's make sure it aligns with what we're saying as an organization, right? You want to have some alignment there. But I think there's probably so much genius and wisdom within our organizations that goes untapped. I certainly see this with my clients all the time. Typically the people with the most insights to share are like, the ones working by themselves in an office with their computer, and until you sit down and you ask that person a bunch of questions, you just don't know. So start talking and listening is my biggest piece of advice. That's
great. I don't see any other questions. Mary, is there anything else that you would like to share that you haven't already before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I know we're a little ahead of time here, so I guess we'll allow folks to get some time back in their day, but I would love to connect with all of you on LinkedIn. My email address is also up on the screen. And if anyone has any questions that come to mind later, feel free to email me or find me online, and we can definitely discuss. It was just such an honor to present with you here today. And thank you to everyone who shared questions and comments in the chat.
Thank you, Mary. And Mary's email address is mary@marytindall, TINDALL Writes.com. If you want to reach out to her, we can start our closing slides. And thank you, Mary, for all that you shared today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Make sure you look out for our next webinar. It's scheduled for February 23rd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. It's presented by Julie Johnson Navarra, and it's entitled How Cause Organizations Can Write Effective Social Media Content for Key Audiences. Until next time, I encourage you to consider joining the communications group, which you can find after clicking on groups on the front page of the website. This will enable you to connect with other people engaged in marketing and communications. Thank you to everyone who joined and participated with us. I'm Heather Pubels, along with Mary Kay and Hannah, our production